Hi, my name is Kai. I'm a winter naturalist at ACES, and so you might see me in my natural habitat walking around giving snowshoe tours around the valley. ACES partners with the Wilderness Workshop and Roaring Fork Audubon to co-host Naturalist Nights, a free speaker series featuring experts who explore different topics relating to the natural world. We would like to thank our generous sponsors that help make Naturalist Nights a success. Our gold sponsors are Garfield and Hecht, Reese Henry, and Ken Ransford. This presentation is being filmed and will be available on the Wilderness Workshop and ACES YouTube channels. I'm now excited to introduce tonight's speaker, Delia Malone. Delia volunteers as Vice Chair for Roaring Fork Audubon and works as an ecologist with Colorado Natural Heritage Program, where she conducts biological surveys of upland, wetland, and stream habitats and looking for rare plants, animals, and natural communities. Her work across Colorado has brought her to the understanding of the need to rewild our landscape and our humanity by protecting and restoring our natural heritage. When she's not birding, conducting biological surveys, or advocating for native wildlife, you can find her hiking in the high ridges, canyons, and deserts across Colorado. Delia, a former ACES board member, is inspiration for us as naturalists and community members, always engaging with the issues involving this place and environment. Please remember to hold your questions until the end of the presentation, when we will have a brief Q&A session. Thank you, and please welcome Delia Malone.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you for coming out on such a lovely, lovely winter night. So I am Delia Malone. I'm an ecologist, and I have worked throughout Colorado for the past 30 years or so. Our discussion tonight is ostensibly about birds and beavers, but really is about connection. What happens when we disconnect an ecosystem, and what can happen if we choose to restore those connections. Historically, hundreds of millions of beavers lived throughout North America. Trapping and hunting quickly resulted in their extirpation. In 1842 to 1843, when John Charles Fremont, during his journey across the Front Range, reported that he rarely saw any beaver, he frequently wrote of abandoned beaver dams. Reasons for the loss of beaver in the Roaring Fork watershed are similar to the reasons they were lost across the West. Trapping, hunting degraded the riparian areas with livestock overgrazing, conversion to hay meadows to feed their livestock. Current day threats are similar. We continue to lose riparian habitat through degradation, development, building, inappropriate livestock grazing. And we have a new impact that we really didn't have back before we extirpated most of our wolves and our large predators. That new impact are large ungulates, where their populations are exponentially growing and out of control. Recently, the U.S. Forest Service surveyed 12 different stream reaches in the Roaring Fork watershed. They chose 119 randomly selected sites to look for beaver. And of those 119 randomly selected sites, they found that about 53 of them had a sign of or were currently occupied. So a little bit less than half. So the general takeaway message to the Forest Service was that, yes, beaver are here. They're not nearly as abundant as they used to be, and they are sparsely distributed. Importantly, my takeaway message was that we have opportunity for restoration, opportunity for places to bring them to. Settlers, when they came here, they sowed seeds for hay, primarily to feed their livestock. Over in Rocky Mountain National Park is the Kawanichi Valley. And similar to the rest of the West, they sowed their hay, they dug ditches to drain the wetlands because Hay likes to grow on dry soils. And simultaneously, they extirpated the wolves from Rocky Mountain National Park. That was their view at the time. They didn't view wolves as having any value, and they certainly didn't view beaver as having any real value. Thankfully, Rocky Mountain National Park was made into a national park in about 1915 and probably saved the Kawanichi Valley at least up into the 1980s or so. What happened in the 1980s? In the 1980s, Colorado Parks and Wildlife, then Division of Wildlife, introduced moose into Colorado. Why would they do that? Well, they wanted more hunting opportunity, or hunters wanted more hunting opportunity. So they introduced moose into Colorado. Moose likely were here occasionally. They never formed a breeding population, probably because we are basically high desert, and high desert doesn't support wetlands that are extensive enough to support moose. Moose eat about 45 pounds of willow per day. That's a lot of willow. Elk eat about 3 pounds per day. So very rapidly, moose decimated the willow. Well, where there's no willow, there are no beaver. And so very rapidly, the streams, we got to remember that the Kawanichi Valley is the headwaters of the Colorado River. And at that time, in the 1920s, there were so many beaver dams and so many streams that you could not discern the channel of the Colorado River because the beaver had dispersed the flows out. So the Kawanichi Valley was chock-a-block full of beaver dams. What's happened now, since the demise of the willow because of the moose, Dr. David Cooper, who's emeritus professor at Colorado State University, has been doing wetland work forever, is involved with a group of folks to restore the Kawanichi Valley, primarily by restoring beaver. And his estimate is that the Kawanichi Valley has lost 90% of its water because of the lack of beaver dams. Without willow, there are no beaver. Without beaver, there's no hydrologic regime to support the floodplains. Without beaver to build dams to slow and spread out the river flows, the creeks tend to erode into the rapidly flowing gullies. They go deeper and deeper into gullies. And so because the streams become entrenched into the banks, the streams can't get out and overflow to replenish the water and nutrients in those floodplains. The willows can't survive. When the willows die, the beaver leave, and those floodplains become dried and invaded with weeds. And this is a photo, and this is a really blurry screen, but this is a photo in the Kawanichi Valley that used to be full of willow, and now it is primarily dry vegetation. Over on the other side of Rocky Mountain National Park, and I don't mean to pick on Rocky Mountain National Park, but it is a good poster child of what's happened throughout Colorado, and it is a good example of what we could do, what could happen if we restore beaver. So in Rocky Mountain National Park, in Upper Moraine Park, there used to be a place, it still is called Beaver Meadows, but there are no beaver there. The willows became severely overbrowsed by elk. So elk on that side, it's a little drier than the Kawanichi Valley. And because the elk overbrowsed the willows, same story, the beaver left. The water table was lowered because the willow were no longer there to hold on to the soil. So the stream dug into its banks. The banks eroded. The stream could no longer flow out of its banks to replenish the water on the floodplain. Habitat was altered. So I'm supposed to be talking about birds too. And birds are pretty dependent on vegetation. And when we change the vegetation, we change the community of birds that can survive in those vegetation communities. So if you lose the willows because you've lost the beaver, We lose all of the birds that depend on those willows. Wilson's warblers, yellow warblers, flycatchers, olive-sided flycatchers in the adjacent aspen forest. We lose those communities of birds. All the shorebirds go because everything has dried up. So why, oh, why did we have an overpopulation of elk in Rocky Mountain National Park? Well, because wolves were extirpated by the time the park was formed in 1915. Wolves were basically gone from the park because folks at that time thought that without wolves, we would have more elk. With more elk, we'd have more hunting opportunity. What they didn't realize is that ecosystems with large ungulates depend on large carnivores for balance. So, beaver maintain the connection. Remember I said we were going to talk mostly about connections and how things have become disconnected. Beaver are key to maintaining the connection between streams and their floodplains. They do this by raising the water table by their dam building. Without beaver to maintain the dams, we see the streams downcut, we see the streams straightening, they get more velocity, they downcut more, and we see loss of overbanking flows, and we see wetlands drying up and lost, decreased water storage, which results in streams drying. And if we think a little forward, we realize that 80% of our stream miles on the western slope of Colorado come from small first-order streams, small streams, and they all come together to make a very big river, the Colorado River, which is experiencing severe drying. So when we look in this big picture, all of these small streams that are drying up all combine to accumulate that impact to a drying Colorado River. Certainly there's other impacts, but that's part of it. Up until now, beaver management in Colorado has presumed or gone onto the premise that beaver are a nuisance animal. And consequently, management or stewardship or lack of stewardship of beaver in Colorado has been very liberal with regard to trapping and hunting and killing. Primarily, if you are a private landowner and a beaver is being a nuisance, in other words, blocking your culverts, cutting down your trees, you can trap them and kill them any time of the year and as many as you want. The quote, recreational killing of beaver is almost equally as liberal. Basically, there are no, that it was April to October, October to April, there are no limits on the number you can take per day. And there's no limit the number you can take in a season. If you look, not sure many people do, but some people do. If you look on the fur trapping websites, beaver pelts are coming in at about $34. So if we think about the ecological value of beaver and their ability to do what they do, which we'll talk about in a minute, and the market value of beaver, I would suggest that there's a huge disparity. Thankfully, Colorado Parks and Wildlife, who manages wildlife in Colorado, has begun to take a different view of beaver and their value. So this year, CPW is undertaking a revised beaver management plan. And that management plan takes into account the many essential values that beaver bring to us. They've even been elevated to what's called the State Wildlife Action Plan, the SWAP, as a conservation species of concern, which is a major and dramatic change. So, and I hear this so often with regard to so many ecological issues, everything is fine, isn't it? Why do we need to do anything different than what we're doing now? Well, I would suggest that everything is not fine. there's a biodiversity crisis. 1 million of the world's estimated 8 million species of plants and animals are threatened with extinction. 75% of the Earth's land surface has been significantly altered by human action, including 85% of wetlands. Streams are drying, and the U.S. Geological Survey has suggested very clearly that the streams are going to dry even more because of a warming climate. And today, we've got at least 2.9 billion fewer birds than we had just 45 years ago. Why is that? I would suggest that all of these impacts, climate warming, stream drying, development in critical habitat, have come together to result in a dramatic downward decline in bird species. So what can we do about it? What can we do to change that trend? Well, I think one of the answers, one significant, fairly easy way to do that is to restore beaver. So if we look at, for instance, some of the things that beaver do for us, besides their being intrinsically cute and cuddly and very sweet, actually, they're large, and when you hold them, they'll snuggle up. Beaver do a lot for us in their dam building activity. They store water by raising the local water table so that the water overfloods into the floodplain. That floodplain acts as a big storage sponge. They improve water quality by sequestering sediments, which carry a lot of pollutants with them. They sequester a lot of nutrients. Excessive nutrients in streams can be very damaging to the local environment. Their actions actually increase habitat diversity. Beaver complexes aren't just ponds. Through successional processes, when beaver leave to go forage upstream or downstream, those ponds succeed or change into different types of ecosystems, wet meadows, willow shrublands. Each of those types of ecosystems supports a different community of birds. So we see bird diversity increase dramatically in beaver complexes. So how do they do that? That's amazing. This little, 40-pound, not that little, rodent can do all of these marvelous things for us. In riparian areas that are natural, where there's a high water table, that water enables the establishment of willows and aspen and alder and birch. That draws and enables beaver to move into those sites. The beaver, when they move in there, they harvest the willow and the aspen to build their dams and to use as forage. And when they build their dams, that raises the water table even higher. And that water table floods out into the adjacent floodplain. So more willow and more aspen and more birch and more alder grows. And when that raises that water table, we get that whole cycle all over again. Again, those overbanking flows with nutrients and sediment replenish both the water and the nutrients in the adjacent floodplains. So we have this marvelous little cycle going on, where even though, and a lot of folks get upset that they're cutting down their willows or they're cutting down their aspen, it's a cycle that replenishes itself if we just take a little step back and don't demand things quite so quickly, and we take a longer time frame and an approach that we're not really used to. Give it a year, give it 2. Don't have such an immediate demand. The trees and the willow will come back because that has what is evolved. So not only do beaver-created wetlands mitigate some of the impacts of a warming climate, in other words, drying streams and so on, but they actually prevent and can reduce the very cause of climate warming, which is carbon. So carbon is our biggest storehouse of carbon is vegetation. And when that vegetation dies, it often, when it degrades, it starts to release carbon. Except if those twigs and sticks and leaves are at the bottom of a beaver pond, that carbon is stored and it's sequestered at the bottom of the beaver pond because there's moisture and there's cold, and that slows down the degradation of those twigs and sticks. And so that carbon is not released back up into the atmosphere. So beaver ponds actually can reduce climate warming with their dam building activity. And again, I want to go back. We're supposed to be talking about birds, and I love birds, and this is key here. Because through this process of succession, there is a diversity of habitats that develop in a beaver complex. When we look at this photograph here, we see open water, but there's also patches of wet meadow, and there's patches of shrubland. And adjacent to those wet meadows are forests. So in that complex of that mosaic of ecosystems, that mosaic is providing habitat for different suites of birds. And that in itself increases the biodiversity. I think it's important to remember that communities that are more naturally diverse are more resilient to environmental perturbations such as a warming climate. Those connections, I like to think of it as a piece of fabric. A piece of fabric that has lots of threads in it is strong. When we start removing the threads, that fabric becomes weaker and weaker. So those threads are like the individual species. When we start removing them, the connections, and we're back to connections, the connections between species and their ecosystem are weakened. When we restore the species, we restore the diversity of species. We restore the connections. Those connections make that system stronger. And so enabling the restoration of beaver to the wetlands will also enable the restoration of the diversity of birds, which will feed back in a very positive way to enable our environment to be more resilient to a warming climate. So this all goes through this process of succession. As beavers shift their foraging centers along a river reach, we've got to give them enough room. Habitat undergoes this succession, creating this diversity of habitat, so that the number of bird communities is increased. The types, so we have wetland bird species, we have shrubland bird species, we have wet meadow bird species, we have a diversity of communities. And within those different communities, those different suites of birds, we have bird diversity. So our diversity multiplies, and the resilience, the connections multiply to become stronger and stronger. So I don't want anyone, I started off by saying that these beaver wetlands were one of the impacts, for the reason for the loss of beaver, hundreds of millions of them, was hunting and trapping, but also inappropriate use of riparian areas, particularly with livestock. Well, what we know from the evidence is that livestock grazing is not necessarily incompatible with bird diversity and beaver. There are plenty of examples of ranchers who do it right. And this is one of those examples. So back in 2020, and this is where the technology is going to get sticky, so Adam. Back in 2020, EcoFlight did a flight for Roaring Fork Audubon and a couple of others. We flew from here over to Lamar. And I know you guys stay up here in the mountains, but Lamar is way the heck over there in the very southeastern corner of Colorado. And we went to Dallas Mays Ranch. It's about 18,000 acres. The Sand Creek flows through, about 7 miles of Sand Creek flows through his ranch. And we did a flyover, got kind of a bird's eye view of Dallas May's ranch. Dallas May is kind of an anomaly. He keeps about half of his ranch for wildlife. He grows cattle on the other half of his ranch. He is recently, CPW, they did a black-footed ferret reintroduction onto his ranch. He has prairie chickens. And he has also, in the beaver wetlands on his ranch, an amazing diversity of birds in these beaver wetlands. Black rails, which are hugely rare, are there. And everyone else that goes into a beaver wetland.
People have to be able to make their mortgage payments, and the way of life in this part of the country is you have to be able to farm and ranch, and sometimes that means plowing native grassland. Part of what we're doing is trying to maintain the natural setting that we have on the ranch. We have Sand Creek. It dissects the ranch for 7 miles, runs right through the middle of it.
The 7 or 8 miles of Sand Creek is a situation that we found when the trappers and the early settlers came through. All these small ephemeral streams that we see today in the plains parts of Colorado, Kansas, Montana, Nebraska, they all had water storage, and they were all percolated and populated with beavers.
Most native grasslands disappeared so they could be farmed. But this ranch, because Sand Creek goes through the middle of it, it was protected from that. And now we have the opportunity to continue. That's the challenge we have, is how do we not mess it up? When you're driving along the highways, you don't really notice that you're looking, especially out here on the eastern plains, you can see for 50, 60 miles in one direction. And you think that's just barren land that, you know, really doesn't have that much diversity or a contribution to the environment. But I think when you're flying over it and you start to see these different biotypes and systems, you realize the diversity that is actually out there. And you see the areas that maybe have some emergent wetlands, and they're just magnets. As you go over a place like this ranch, it is potential to keep these places intact and become a magnet for seeds, species to move out into other areas. One thing that is a huge focus in these wetlands is we have a lot of beaver.
Look out the right side, you can look right into the wetlands on Sand Creek.
So these wetlands provide just a huge number of both intrinsic value and ecosystem service values to humans. Beaver are considered what's called a keystone species. And what a keystone species, what that means is that given their numbers, they have a disproportionately high and positive impact that reverberates throughout ecosystems. Not only do they mitigate a warming climate, they provide amelioration of many of the impacts of a warming climate. In water storage, as you know, particularly in our surrounding, if you look at the surrounding landscape, which is dominated by agriculture, those soils are actually releasing carbon, whereas the soils in that wetland are storing carbon. So they act as a really important balance against the impacts that we did by our agricultural practices. So maintaining that wetland, maintaining those beaver dams, it ameliorates both climate change and its impact.
This is an ecosystem that we've basically moved on from. We don't understand it. We've got more information on the high country throughout Colorado, and we probably have more information on the moon itself than we do on the importance of an ecosystem out here where we are today in Lamar on the prairie.
Native grasslands have so long been overlooked. 10 years ago, we started trying to do some conservation work, and every time I mentioned the fact that we were on the eastern Great Plains and a short grass prairie, there wasn't a lot of interest. Because when people think of conservation, they think of mountains and trees and streams and scenic areas. When in truth, the short grass prairies of the Great Plains have more diversity, have more species of wildlife, more species of plants, insects, and they contribute to the environment more than most people realize.
Okay, so another benefit that beaver activity brings to an arid western landscape is fire prevention or fire mitigation. In 2022, a fire swept through the Dallas's 18,000 acre ranch. The fire covered about 9,000 acres of that ranch. And Dallas basically credits the beaver dams in dampening and slowing the spread of the fire by backing up the natural wetlands so that the area surrounding those beaver dams was also wet and water doesn't burn. So it's a very simple concept. In addition to dampening and slowing the spread and containing the spread of that fire, those beaver wetlands also provide a refuge during the fire for lots and lots of animals. Obviously below is the fire, and then just really 2 months later is what it looked like after the fire. So there's been dramatic recovery. Another big kind of bird in the room is climate warming. So although according to a climate change vulnerability analysis that the Colorado Natural Heritage Program did for the Bureau of Land Management, we did that back in 2013 or so, beaver are considered moderately vulnerable to our warming climate. On the other hand, if we can bring them back, they will undo the very reason that they are vulnerable. They're vulnerable because water and streams are drying. Beaver do exactly what they need to do to prevent their own demise. If they're abundant enough and they're widespread enough, they can mitigate the drying impact of a warming climate. And by the way, the species, the wetland species, the wetland obligate species, the riparian obligate species of birds benefit from that. So, for instance, long-billed curlew was ranked highly vulnerable to a warming climate, primarily because of the loss of wetlands and the loss of water. Western yellow-billed cuckoos, a listed threatened species, moderately vulnerable because our riparian habitats are being lost and streams are drying. And when streams dry, the riparian vegetation is lost, and the riparian vegetation upon which western yellow-billed cuckoos depend is also lost. White-faced ibis. We actually had a white-faced ibis out at North Star a couple years ago. White-faced ibis are moderately vulnerable. The same story. They depend on wetlands. And when wetlands are lost, they are also lost. So by restoring these wetlands, pretty low-key, low-tech solution, restoring beaver. So beyond their intrinsic, inherent, awesome beauty, birds provide us humans with a lot of ecological services, so-called ecosystem services. Some of those are really clear. They're bioindicators when we start there because they're so sensitive to a warming climate. When birds start to decline, it's a warning call for us. They act as pollinators for hummingbirds, broad-tailed hummingbirds, and broad-tailed hummingbirds are actually declining. They act as seed dispersers to grow forests. So the Clark's nutcracker is one of our key forest dispersing species. When they cache their pine nuts in the ground, they remember about 2/3 of where their caches are. They don't remember about 1/3 of where they've cached their pine nuts, and those regenerate into forest. So birds are important in regrowing forests. And of course, pest control. So you may not like barn swallow nests on your eaves, but those barn swallows are really important to controlling things like mosquitoes. So birds are really important for us. If we can't appreciate them for their beauty, which I hope we all do, and their amazing ability to do what they do provide us with a lot of important benefits. Unfortunately, as we've seen and has been documented, birds are declining. The loss of birds means also the loss of wetlands, the loss of birds, the loss of ecosystems and the services that they provide. And we also lose all of that beauty that they bring to us. Services like a simple service, and when we see turkey vultures or bald eagles, which are primarily scavengers, or crows or ravens foraging on roadkill, they are basically doing a huge service for us in getting rid of that roadkill and not allowing the spread of disease, for instance. When we see birds decline, we lose that service. One of the biggest groups of birds that are declining are our common birds. So it's not just these rarities like white-faced ibis that are declining. It's the common birds that provide really important services like carcass removal. What can we do to restore? What can we do to change this trend? I would suggest that we can begin by rewilding. Rewilding simply means restoring connections, restoring native species, and getting rid of or controlling some of the troublesome non-native species. One of this, in this photograph on the left, is we have two photo points. It's the same place. On the left, cattle have been removed from riparian habitat, and in a very short time, willow have come back. In the right, took 9 years? But with the return of willow, we see the return of beaver because they have forage material and they have dam-making material, and we see the return of the birds upon which that habitat relies. On the left, there's not much habitat for birds. There's no habitat for beaver. So we see this cascading of effects, of negative effects. So why rewild? Rewilding by restoring native species. We can restore the connections. We makes ecosystems stronger, more resilient to perturbations that we ourselves have caused, like a warming climate. And I'm going to give this example, and if anybody knows me, a few people in the audience know me, you're not going to get a talk out of me without talking about wolves. So this is from Voyageurs National Park. And in Voyageurs National Park, they have about, quite a few beaver, 3,000 or so, and depending on the year, 30 to 60 wolves. And those wolves in the summer, about half of their food are beaver, And then during winter, they switch back to their other major part of their diet, which is moose up in that neck of the woods. So we're going to look at a quick view of this little wolf that's on camera. And before we do, I want to just point out that another major, important, essential impact of rewilding is balance. And what do I mean by balance? Well, ecosystems that have evolved with large ungulates, moose, elk, need predators to moderate their populations. Without, and we've seen so many examples of it just in this few minutes, Rocky Mountain National Park with too many elk, Rocky Mountain National Park with too many moose. We can look to Yellowstone. We can look to Isle Royale with too many moose. We can look up to Denali. We can look wherever we see ecosystems that have evolved with large ungulates, where their predators have been removed. We see an ecosystem out of balance. So when we talk about wolves in this system, in Voyageurs National Park, yeah, they eat a few beaver. Beaver populations have not been impacted. They've remained stable. What wolves do in this system is moderate moose populations. When we see too many moose, as we see in the Kawanichi Valley, we see the loss of willow. And when we see the loss of willow, we see the loss of beaver. When we see the loss of beaver, we see the loss of water, and we see the loss of birds. It's connected. How can we restore those connections? I think it's important, interesting little notation on that little interaction is that wolves wade along the trails where beaver have gone away from their ponds. And I think that's really interesting because as beaver start to eat too much of the willow so that there's no willow left and there's no aspen left, they have to move further and further away from the ponds to get enough material to eat and to build their dams with. And that leaves them vulnerable to predation by wolves or cougars or whoever it is. What happens then is they leave those ponds, if they survive, and they move to other places, which allows that process of succession to occur where the pond turns into a wet meadow and turns into a forest. And then they can come back a decade later and restart that process. So the process of the beaver wetland complex is just that. It's a process. It's a process that moves through time and changes. And we need to give beaver and wolves and moose or elk enough space to do that. So let's look briefly at North Star Nature Preserve. Back in, and most everybody here, I'm sure, is familiar with North Star. Back in 2000, Roaring Fork Audubon, with a couple of other groups, undertook to do biological surveys at North Star to document the life there, to try to inform a management plan that protected North Star for the nature preserve that it could be. And there's some folks in this audience that participated in those surveys. So thank you, Charlie. At the time, there were no active beaver dams or lodges. As far as the bird community goes, though it was, and still is, diverse and abundant. So Roaring Fork Audubon, in 1999, together with, at the time, it was Rocky Mountain Bird Observatory with Arvind Punjabi, myself, Linda Vidal, Heather Hopton, we undertook to do bird surveys. We had 63 species in 786 individuals. That was enormous. The heron rookery, there were 15 active nests. In 2018, Pitkin County conducted biological surveys. Beaver have returned. There's several surface lodges, there's several bank lodges. Bird surveys documented 342 individuals in 52 species, and there are no heron nests remaining. Gee, that just undid and undermined my whole talk, didn't it? Because beaver are back, we're supposed to see more birds, we're supposed to see more diversity. What happened? Wildlife meets recreation. The recreational impacts of human on human intolerant species is enormous. Decades of scientific research has come to recognize that recreation is a leading factor in endangerment of bird species is one of the main causes of the decline of all threatened and endangered species in the United States. Effects include behavioral responses such as increased flight, physiological responses such as reduced reproduction, and abandonment of those sites. So, even though beaver are back, not all is good. Roaring Fork Audubon has undertaken to find sites for appropriate restoration of beaver. Appropriate means that they have the right ecological situation, the right environment, but also means that we have human tolerance. Because if we're missing one, we're not going to be successful. So we have gone out and we've identified a few sites that would be appropriate for reintroduction. We've conducted breeding bird surveys to document the birds that are there now. And depending on the future, we hope to reintroduce beaver to those sites. If those sites are not yet ready, if because of the loss of beaver, the streams have begun to downcut, then we propose to do habitat restoration to prepare the habitat for beaver, to get them ready. So we put in what are called beaver dam analogs. It kind of mimics a beaver dam. The water table can come up. The floodplain, the water in those downcut channels can overflow. Willow will regrow, and that will hopefully entice the beaver and the birds. So finally, restoring wildlife, rewilding to restore connections, in my opinion, can only be successful if we rewild our hearts. If we open our hearts and reconnect with the wild. If we find the compassion in us to appreciate and have the grace to give wildlife the room and the protection they need to restore a beaver or a wolf, only to have it trapped or shot, can't be successful. It can't be compassionate conservation. Rewilding our hearts is essential. Reconnecting ourselves with the natural world is as important if not more, than restoring the animal itself. So I'll finish with another quote from Aldo Leopold. To keep every cog and wheel is the first precaution of intelligent tinkering. When we lost an extirpated beaver, we really didn't appreciate all the services that beaver provide. We didn't know that we were going to have a warming climate and all of the other calamities that humans have brought. So keeping every cog and wheel is important. We don't know what beaver might provide in the future. It might be really important. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Delia. We now have time for a few questions. Raise your hand and I'll bring the microphone around and you can ask Delia.
Just a quick comment. Dee was talking about the studies that we did. We also, along the banks, planted willows to stabilize the banks. At North Star, there's an old saying, no good deed goes unpunished. Let's reverse that. That good deed was rewarded with now we have the beaver.
Thank you, Charlie.
What is the number one deterrent for doing what you want to do?
Oh, boy. There's not one. Probably there's several. One of the big issues, and this is why we're focused on public land, are water rights. So on public land, typically on forest land, often on BLM land, those agencies have the water rights, and that's why we need to focus on public lands. Another deterrent is the idea that if a beaver is being a nuisance, the only way to deal with that nuisance is to kill it. And so we have a lot of trapping still going on, and we need to rethink that because it's actually fairly easy to deal with the nuisance elements of beaver. We have beaver deceivers, we have culverts, we have culvert traps, and so on. So we don't have to kill them to deal with the nuisance aspect of beaver. Another, probably a bigger picture, is the idea that animals are here for us to be killed. Animals are here for us and for our benefit. And that mindset is somewhat pervasive still in the West.
The number one deterrent for housing in the valley is NIMBYism. So is NIMBYism then one of your major issues, not on my backyard or not on my ranch or land?
I think it is. And I think a remedy to that is information. Because not in my backyard, if you don't want your aspen trees cut down, it's a fairly simple remedy. We can have beaver. We don't have to have the nuisance factor. If they're blocking your culverts, there's a fairly easy solution to that. So lack of information, and this is one of the reasons that I agreed to come and talk to everybody. We need to get that message out there. We can have both. We really can. And we can have the benefits of both. We don't have to kill things to solve our problems.
This is a marvelous presentation.
Well, thank you.
But is it a presentation that could be given in public high schools? And is
Absolutely.
in public high schools?
Absolutely.
So that information sharing is so important.
Yes, it is.
I have two questions. The first is, how far will a beaver range to find new territory? I mean, you're putting in, pseudo beaver dams, and to sort of recreate a willow meadow and so on and so forth. But are then those areas populated with transported beavers, or do wild beavers show up? And if they do, how far away do they come from?
You wouldn't think that this short-legged, waddly little critter could move very fast and far, 30, 40 miles. They can go over high divides. They will find the place. So our hope with a beaver dam analog that kind of mimics the beaver to recreate is that beaver would come in there on their own. But we could also, if that's not happening, we could also bring beaver there. So a friend of mine over in West Mam Creek, as an example of how little they need, she had a stream maybe a meter wide, an area maybe as wide as this, a riparian habitat maybe as wide as this room. She wanted beaver. Some folks put up a beaver dam analog, built up the riparian area in about 2 years. The beaver didn't come on their own, but they reintroduced some, and they are happy as happy can be. The riparian habitat has expanded threefold. The beaver are moving up and down, and it's been a huge success.
That's really good. My second question had to do with the performance of the watershed. You were saying that that without the beaver, we'll end up with less water into the Colorado. But I don't understand the math on that. If you have a certain amount of rainfall in the watershed, let's say it's 1,000,000 cubic feet. So, I mean, I'm sure it's thousands of times that. And you have a fast-moving stream, it's going to go down to the Colorado, and probably with less evaporation than with being spread out over large areas by beaver ponds. Admittedly, the beaver ponds, slow down the transit of the water, and they increase soil saturation. But the same amount of water is coming down per unit time, minus evaporation. So how does beaver ponds increase the amount of water getting down to the Colorado over a unit of time? I can see that it evens out the flow, but I don't see that you end up with more water.
So it does even out the flow, but then that's a big question. To try to make it simple and short, it's important to understand that most of the water that is stored in a beaver complex is not in the open water pond. Most of the water that's stored is in the adjacent soaked up soils. And so because there is vegetation on that soil, there's a lot of pieces here, because there is vegetation covering that soil, hopefully, that prevents evaporative loss. So yes, there's evaporative loss off the pond, but there's very minimal evaporative loss off of the wetlands, not the open water pond, but the wetlands because of the vegetation. So evaporative loss because of climate warming is one of the main factors that is drying up our streams. We're getting as much water, but what we're not getting, we're getting increased evaporative loss. Because the atmosphere is warmer, it can hold more water. And so we don't get we're getting all of this evaporative loss out of the soils. It's being held up onto here, and it's not going into the streams. If we, to your first point, yes, there's a lot of precipitation coming down. And what happens with that precipitation, typically in Colorado, is that if there's no beaver dams around, there's a huge flooding flow in the spring. I'm sure you've noticed that. And that flooding flow goes down into the Colorado and gets sucked up by the irrigation people before it gets to the Gulf of Mexico. If we hold on to that water, we don't have as much evaporative loss. We have it slowly moving into the streams. The streams maintain sufficient flow to provide water for fishes and birds and so on and so forth. So it has to do with the climate cycle, and that we've altered that climate cycle, and because of excessive warming. And so we have more water being evaporated. Beaver ponds dampen that beaver ponds. I shouldn't say that because the ponds themselves don't, because there is evaporative loss, but it's the surrounding floodplain wetlands, the wet meadows and the shrublands that are preventing that loss and storing that water. Does that make sense?
Well, it makes sense that it's storing it and it is slowing it down. But I still don't see how it increases the amount of water that gets to the Colorado over a year.
It's inhibiting the evaporative loss. And it's not the ponds. The ponds maybe literally, when you look at a complex and some of those photos that I had, the ponds themselves may be 10% of the wetland. 80 to 90% is the surrounding complex of wet meadows and shrublands and so on. And they are holding onto that water instead of letting it being evaporated up into the atmosphere. And that evaporation is what essentially, we're not, it's interesting because we're not changing the amount of precipitation that we're getting in Colorado according to our climate change data. It's coming at different times, it's coming in different forms, but it's the soil warming that is causing the drought. And that soil warming is resulting in excessive evaporation. And that is the key to why, well, it's not the only key. We've got tremendous irrigation diversions and so on out of Colorado. But this factor as to how beaver can restore and help restore the flows has to do with climate and warming and excessive evaporation.
I agree.
Rachel, and then up here.
Thank you for your presentation, Dee, and your incredibly eloquent explanations of these complex topics.
Thank you, Rachel.
I don't know if this is really accurate, but to add to the last conversation, I think it also has a lot to do with return flows. And the longer the water can actually seep in, you get a better return flow. And return flows are critical in late summer and the drier periods to recharging the Colorado. So, a lot of the water that we see when we haven't had rain for a month that's still coming out has been the return flow from the deep saturation. But what I wanted to touch on, because you're an expert, is the new wolf introduction that has been happening. And I know you've been an advocate against some very fierce foes for that for a long time. The recent newspaper story said the release is happening in the Eagle and Pitkin areas. So I was kind of assuming that might be the hunter wilderness up above us where we connect with Eagle County. Do you know anything or any fun details you can give us about the newest wolf reintroduction?
Well, let me say, Rachel, thank you, because I always, as you know, love to talk about wolves. I actually don't want to share because we need to keep the wolves safe. We need to keep, and CPW, let me say this too. CPW is doing an exemplary job of reaching out to the livestock producers to provide them with the tools they need to prevent conflict with wolves. And it's that conflict prevention. We know it works. We know we can do it. We know that it's worked up in the Northern Rockies for decades. We can take that information and apply it here. And in fact, on Monday down in Glenwood Springs, I'm hosting a cattle rancher and a sheep rancher from up in Idaho that will talk about what they're doing. So if you want to drive on down to Glenwood, 5:30 to 7:30 Monday evening at the Glenwood Springs Branch Library. So it's my knowing that we will soon hear the howls once again after a century of wolves in the mountains. And I know that if we rewild our hearts and give wolves and beaver the compassion and grace that I know we're capable of, we'll be successful. So thank you for that.
Give your time for one.
This quick.
You heavy too. Then it's just... few years ago, I participated in something at North Star where we were trying to recreate a fen. And since that area is off limits and you have to cross private land to get to it, what has been the result of that, and how might it affect at least birds, if not beavers?
The status of that fen, it's just a tiny remnant patch of a fen, is, I wouldn't say it's stable. There's a lot of issues with that fen, and we've got natural drying going on. Most of the water that supports that fen is coming off of the slopes and then discharging out into the valley floor. Probably one of the biggest negative impacts to that fen is the canary reedgrass that has invaded in there. And canary reedgrass it was planted for livestock. Nothing much uses it, nothing nests in it, nothing breathes in it, nothing eats it, except cows. And it has invaded as the fen starts to dry. Fens are one of my favorite things to talk about, actually. The water maintains the vegetation, and the vegetation maintains the water. It's this very reciprocal process. And when you start drying, be it by natural processes or human processes, because when they throw the rancher straight into the river, the goal was to drain those uplands, and he wasn't successful, because a lot of that water that discharges into North Star was coming off the slope, was coming off of Aspen Mountain. And so the remnant fen remained, but the water into that fen isn't sufficient to maintain it. And the drying, has enabled the invasion of the canary reedgrass, which further degrades the fen. So it's kind of this balance that's not balanced anymore. Just as a side bit, when we did the bird surveys in 1997, 98, 99, we also did hydrology. And when we put down our water pits, we found enormous deposition, several meters of peat, indicating that that entire valley floor historically was a large fen. And so what you're seeing back at that corner is kind of the remnant, the leftover part of that. So I don't know that that's a good story. I don't know it's a bad story, but it's what it is.
Thank you. Your presentation was fantastic.
Thank you.
What was that bird on the May Ranch slide?
Black
What
rail.
was that bird?
A black rail.
Okay, thank you.
It's quite rare. And so just as an aside, as a shout out to Dallas May, his ranch has been honored with an Audubon Award for being a ranch that is compatible between livestock and birds. So he manages it really carefully, and he manages it for wildlife as well as to make a living. Good. Thank you.